Okay, so yeah, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third seminar of this year's Debating Development Lecture Series. My name is Ivan Ashaba. I'm a teaching assistant and a PhD candidate at the Institute of Development Policy here at the University of Antwerp, and I'll be your moderator for tonight's event. Debating Development is an annual series that has been taking place for the last 18 years. This year it is taken as an interfaculty course and organized as a partnership between the Institute of Development Policy and the University Foundation for Development Cooperation, USOS, with the generous financial support from the Global Minds program. We are really excited that we have a lineup of guests who will chat with us tonight, who I will introduce to you shortly. Our sessions always have the precursor of debating the dominant and accepted paradigm of what we call development. This term at times refers to the structural and long-term industrialization of so-called underdeveloped countries within neoliberal economic policies. For example, the opening up of borders with unhindered economic trade and investment, all as neo-colonial processes of resource extraction. Similarly, aid is a term that is used to maintain astronomical flows of development knowledge and resources from north to south. You cannot talk about development and ignore the academia, or knowledge production, or scientific discovery, or even innovation. So a reminder that this year's topic is on alternative perceptions of time and temporalities. And it is within that realm that tonight's conversation contributes to the overarching theme by looking at slowness from the perspective of academia and knowledge production. So within this call for a slowdown, several terms are used. You hear of slow academy, slow professor, slow scholarship, slow science. And I should also add that discussions of slowing down academia or challenging the culture of speed have been around for years and only gained prominence recently. So what are the causes and consequences of speed and acceleration in academia? That's like a question that you would encounter most of the time. Is it managerialism, neoliberalization, or academic capitalism? And how then do we move forward? Do we need an internal discussion among academics or a sort of reform of institutions from inside? And if that is the case, how? Also, would legislation be the way forward? It's also a question now for us. But also, is there a danger that in critiquing acceleration, we pay little attention to some of its positive features? Think, for example, about, and I quote, sparks of inspiration, innovation, inventiveness, and other positive acceleration components. Can we accommodate, and here again I quote, the need for the slow tempo of contemplation and reflection and the faster energetic rhythm of discovery and research? So there's of course much more to these discussions than what I've just hinted on above. But if you were to take away a couple of points from tonight's conversation, I would suggest that you pay attention to the following elements. So first, the keynote speaker will argue his case for a responsibly stagnant academia and what that entails. Then the discussant will reflect on the applicability of responsible stagnation as a concept. So this brings me to introducing our two speakers who will break down the topic of slowness and knowledge production. Let me first introduce Filip Vostal. Filip is a senior research associate, Center for Science, Technology, and Social Studies, Institute of Philosophy of the Czech Academy of Sciences. and his research interests encompass sociology of time, science and technology studies, and critical social science. Filip is the author of the book Accelerating Academia, The Changing Structure of Academic Time, a 2016 book, and has also published several articles, including one that the students had to read in preparation for this webinar, and has also published several blogs. Our other speaker is Valerie De Craene. Valerie is a postdoctoral researcher, activist, and scholar who engages in analyzing contemporary politics of science and is an active member of Slow Science in Belgium. She's interested in the production of knowledge, ranging from epistemological, methodological, and ethical dimensions of doing embodied research to the political economy of higher education, the neoliberal university, and slow science. So I will not be wasting a lot of time. I'm going to be giving the floor to Filip, but perhaps before I do that, more like some in-house keeping. You have a Q&A function where I would advise you to start when the discussion starts to put in your questions. And my colleague we're organizing the debate together, Mark, who is also an assistant here, will keep track of those questions. And together with the questions already sent in by the students who had to read an article, and will be able to guide us with our discussion and moving forward. So allow me to hand over the microphone or to hand over the time slot to Filip, who will have around 30 minutes or so to make his intervention. And thereafter, we'll proceed from there. So Filip, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ivan. I hope that everybody can hear me. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Ivan and Justus for this lovely invitation. It's really an honor for me to be one of the series lecturer or one of the series speaker of this really excellent program that you guys in Antwerpen are running. I really appreciate it. I will just directly, and I would like to thanks to Valerie for being for her willingness to comment on my paper. That's really wonderful. This is the second time I'm introducing this paper or this argument, if you like. That as Ivan has already mentioned, the lecture is called "For Responsibly Stagnant Academia," and I believe that you, like me, have heard and read quite a number of accounts on how we academics suffer of chronic busyness, and how we academics nowadays are almost convulsively busy, how we academics are victims, often passive victims, of some more or less hidden, what I would call temporal conspiracy that is comprised of various time thieves and what I call in the book that Ivan mentioned, accelerating academic structures. I will just repeat myself. I did write a book about this theme. It was published in 2016. But over the years, after its publication in particular, I realized that by drawing attention to accelerating academia, I've been actually co-generating something. I've been co-generating the proliferation of various calls for slowdown, for academic slowdown. And I've been mobilizing what I see and what I call the escalating victimization discourse, and what is visible also in many countries, at many universities, a kind of culture of excessive complaining, which is indeed legitimate. And those mushrooming and often radically voiced critiques of academia, including my own, have had, unfortunately, very little effect on academic cultures, governance, and management and performance ideologies all around the world. And so today or tonight, I would like to take a slightly different approach. Then I don't want to rehearse another critique of fast academia and promote slow academia kind of account or argument. I've recently, when it was published, I think it's 2019, I read a fascinating book by Stevie de Saille and her colleagues, where I think I've shared with you the introductory chapter, or I kind of kindly asked you to engage a little bit with this chapter. And they introduce, in this book, they introduce a notion of responsible stagnation as a sort of economic model, which is bypassing the dogma of endless economic growth, which is a kind of the alpha and omega of contemporary capitalism, and not just contemporary capitalism, it's alpha and omega of capitalist modernity, if you like. And what I want to do now is I would like to do an experiment, if you wish. I would like to apply this notion of responsible stagnation. I would like to apply it to the academy. Let's see if that works. And I would be curious what you think about this experiment of mine. The reason why I want to do that is that I do think that stagnation contains, as a sociologist of time, I do think that stagnation contains a very important temporal kind of element, or that it has a kind of temporal connotations. Stand still, break, pause, stand by, stop over. It's kind of stagnation is from a linguistic point of view, it's very similar. And I think that they are worth, these notions, the baggage that I call stagnation, they are worth addressing when we look at academic environments that we academics are both subjects to. And we as well, it's something that we often forget, I would dare to say, we often co-shape this environment by our very activities and also kind of non-activities, if I can put it like that, things that we know, practices, if you wish, practices, practical daily behavior, practical ways of reasoning that drives our behavior as human beings and as academics. So I will therefore argue today for responsibly stagnant academia, which I believe it's clear from the title of my talk, responsible stagnant academia as a form of temporal enclave, as I call it, that is both loosely connected as well as disconnected to its wider environment. Academia doesn't exist in a vacuum, it's a social system that is well connected to other social systems, as many sociologists would have argued. Especially, the way why I'm saying that is that we should bear this in mind, especially in those cases when we look at various kind of temporal fabric and texture of modern era, and how various systems within modern era, within modernity, actually interact with one another. This is not from me, this is from, this idea of various kind of systemic rhythms and paces and tempos comes from many, probably the most important scholar in this sense is Hartmut Rosa. And looking at academia from temporal perspective, something that I've been doing for past 15 years, when we do that, I think that a fundamental kind of distinction emerges at the first sight. Because I think that academia, and again, it's not just me, I'm just synthesizing arguments of many other important scholars. I think that academia is a unique social space which is oscillating between ever more prevalent chronos and diminishing kairos. You might have heard these two terms that are Greek terms, and they both mean time, but they have slightly different meanings. Because chronos, that by the way, has managed to kind of travel into various kinds of languages and has different kinds of features kind of in a different forms in various kinds of languages. Chronos is a kind of what we can see as a strictly measured time, and Kairos is time which is measured by events. And when we look at the past 6 or 7 centuries, probably more, working in academia in various seminars, theological seminars, if you like, has been organized around regular and more or less predictable rhythms of terms, semesters, lectures, seminars of a given time length. There have indeed been different temporal habits, different time habits and norms in different higher education systems, in different sort of socio-historical epochs, if you like. But one thing they very likely have in common is that they are fixed. They are kind of mechanical. They are repetitive. If we look at Northern modernity, I'm not saying that this should be an example, but if we look at the Northern modernity of past 200 years, the rulers, if you like, the political, the socio-economic and political class has often organized time according to Gregorian calendar and the invention of clock time. And one might say that academic calendar and academic clocks co-shape the conduct of teaching in particular and academic service. And we might say in a very simple terms that academia has always had its own opening hours, like 9 to 5, or not really 9 to 5, but you know what I mean by that. But scientific conduct or research, if you wish, is a different story. Because scientific conduct and research, the reason is that scientific conduct and research is much more unruly and event-driven than teaching. For instance, what do I mean by that? For instance, certain biological processes, biological phenomena under investigation, if we look at natural sciences and basic research in natural sciences, it can hardly be, or it can be, but it's always a very, very tricky intervention. But what I want to say is that it can hardly be temporally modified. Of course, it can be, if we talk to various kinds of physicists, for instance, like I do. Of course, you know, various temporal processes can be modified, accelerated or slowed down, but it's already an intervention into the natural biological rhythms. So I shouldn't be reminding for too long that research has its own unique uneven rhythms, ebbs and flows, unknown unknowns, as Donald Rumsfeld and Slavoj Žižek said, unpredictabilities, temporal unruliness in this set contains various kinds of moments in inverted commas, you know, lengths and paces, that are oftentimes very difficult to anticipate, predict. There are processes that slow down, speed up, they stand still suddenly, you know. There's lots of waiting involved. There's lots of prolonging, extending, you know, abruption is something very, very common in various kinds of experimental research. And when it comes to the notion of invention, which I like very much, not that I'm an inventor myself, I wish I could be, but I'm not, you know, I'm just a random guy. But in my next life, I hope I will be an inventor, you know, that's I like this kind of category, if I can put it like that. But maybe it's the kind of wannabe dream. But anyway, when it comes to invention, which is, I think, very critical in any kind of research activity, search and research to me are very interesting notions. You know, research as a kind of repeated search for something. If you look at the etymology of the word in English, and if you look at this at research and search for something that we do all the time, I think, in academia, in scientific research, in scientific conduct. I think that many of us, and Ivan already mentioned that, and thanks Ivan for this. Many of us have often experienced moments of eureka, like Archimedes, in the bathtub, or aha moment, like the bulb, above your hair and above your head, when everything that we are looking at the given time, at the given moment, being it sort of microscopic or macroscopic in its essence, suddenly clicks together. And for a moment we might know, yeah, we might introduce something, but then we can reflect on it and return back and maybe reevaluate and move forward. So then, the post aha moment, the post eureka is a different kind of thing. But what I'm talking about is this kind of productive, exciting acceleration that takes place on an almost kind of phenomenological level, which I would never underestimate. And I don't read about it that much in various kinds of accounts that tackle that would belong to the category of critical sociology of higher education. And the thing is that in natural and technical sciences, if you look at the ground, if you are in the field, if one is in the field doing a kind of anthropology of science, which I've been trying to do in past 6-7 years, you encounter oftentimes, and I will be using a bit of a STS vocabulary, science and technology studies vocabulary. What you encounter as an anthropologist of science is what I would call technological assemblages, which are necessary conditions for any kind of experiment. And the thing is, once you are there, once you kind of work with scientists, once you engage with scientists and their environment, what you often experience is a sudden that things suddenly stop working, and that the notion of repair time, for instance, is very critical in those kinds of scientific areas that I happen to be engaging with. And also what I've figured out over the years is that research conduct, and now that's regardless of disciplines, I would say, is very often accompanied by what I would call productive waste of time, and by sort of undeterminable time for writing and rewriting, and of course reading, which is super underestimated category when it comes to being what it means to be a scholar today, what it means to be an academic. So overall, I would say that time in the academy oscillates between two basic temporal modalities. It is indeed driven by mechanical protocols that are grounded in a mere functionality, and repetition within precise temporal brackets. A seminar, our session today has 2 hours, right? So we've got this temporal brackets for today's discussion, and everybody knows that. Without this, we won't be able to get together now. It's how many of us? 72 people. We won't be able to meet if we don't have these temporal brackets, would be. So that's one thing. The other thing is that academic scientific time, I would say in this matter, research time is highly unruly, as I've tried to say above. However, as we all know, somehow, I would assume, the very interplay between this kind of mechanical temporality and the unruly temporality has been subject in past decades, I would say, to neoliberal economistic sort of arithmetic, and I would even say one-dimensional rationality of that currently dominates organization structures and cultures of academia. Not all over the world, but in most of the places, I would say. Things would be probably very different in Global South, in some parts of Global South, not in all of them. Dominant sort of knots or sites in the university governance are now what we are all familiar with. Universities are full of the executives, finance committees, people who run real estate businesses for the university, sport facilities management, development offices, and many, many more, right? University, IT, IT is now a major department, major thing at any university, and it has always been like that. But nowadays it's dominating. It's the business model. But there are two puzzles here for me. First puzzle, how come that academics either turn so smoothly into hardcore managers? So that's one puzzle. That's the first puzzle. And second puzzle, which is related to the first puzzle, is that how come that academics allow the takeover by the corporate ideology so quickly, so effortlessly even? And I'm deliberately provocative here. And there is even a third thing I would say when I'm thinking about it now, because equally mysteriously to me, how come that, we have piles of critique now, hordes of books and articles and texts, texts criticizing the contemporary academia that are in circulation, but they are circulating in what I would call sort of unconquerable hermeneutical circle. How come? Why is that? That's a question that keeps puzzling me not every day, but often. And the ever-growing critique of contemporary academia, I've realized over the years, has very little effect, unfortunately, I should note, on academic governance and underpinning ideologies that sustain academic governance. Where did often deployed and voiced critical tradition that reaches back to Weber, Veblen, Mills, more recently, Derrida, Reddings, Marion Stratton, Sheila Slaughter, you name it, there would be a number of names. But also not just academic accounts, but famous campus novels like David Lodge. Where is this critique? How come that we haven't been able to reflect on this critique in a productive fashion? Or more recently, there's brilliant. It's a brilliant novel it's called "Fight for Your Long Day" by Alex Kudera. You can hear the temporal kind of aspect in the title already. Or "Crump" by P.J. Watson. And Kudera's account is from the U.S., the U.S. environment, the university environment or academic environment, whereas Watson's is more about post 1992. For those of you who are familiar with the British system, it's a sort of a reflection of conditions of existence, basically of human existence in the British system at the post 1992 university. And if I look at the piling critique, the classics of critique of higher education, I think Max Weber was one of the first ones. And if I look at all the accounts, including my own, I'm self-critical here, very consciously and very intentionally. I think that Bruno Latour, despite the controversies that are around him in past decades, he might have been right when in 2004, I think, or 2002, he published this article in Critical Inquiry called "Has Critique Run Out of Steam?" And I think he was partially correct. But the thing is that one of the most popular contemporary reaction that aims to reclaim a particular way of living, a particular way of professional conduct, in academia is entailed in a critique of Speed University, and in the same breath calls for its slowdown, slow academy, slow professor, slow scholarship, and many other things, slow science. In fact, the very idea of academia and slowness in academia has been discussed ever since early 1990s, I think, there were several quite influential texts published in the early 90s. And it is only in past few years that it has, or past decade perhaps, maybe since the beginning of the third millennium, it has gained on some, significant popularity and significant, it has gained significant popularity basically. And indeed, I think that, I for myself, and maybe if I can speak for some other people, I don't want to, but I would dare to say that many of us would welcome if some specific processes and activities in academia would slow down. But I've never been sure about the notion of, whether slow down or slowness, to be more precise. And there's a difference between the two. Whether slowness is an overarching common denominator that should define the new and desired academy. I'm not sure about that. And the slow discourse, I think, offers a well-known critique in a new guise. I'm not saying that it's useless, but I'm just saying that it's just too much of it going on at the moment. And again, I'm very much contributing to this with my own work. And it seems, or the notion of the critique offers a kind of a notion of slowdown that predominantly originates in now upper middle class slow food movement that was co-opted by the Italian from the Italian autonomists, who they are the authors, if you like, of the notion of slow food movement. Slow food, it comes from a highly radical circles from the 1980s Italian big cities. So as you might have probably gathered by now, I don't want to talk about slowness or speed up anymore, or acceleration anymore, but I would like to suggest a slightly different strategy, a strategy that is embedded in practices, activities, and behaviors associated with something all too common for all of us, and that is how we publish. Interestingly enough, or perhaps not that interestingly, if I think about it, nobody has yet came up with the idea of slow publishing. I haven't seen that kind of proposition running around. Everybody needs to publish quickly these days, right? We need to have as many articles as possible by tomorrow. And I would like to be challenged on this by someone, because I don't, well, we can get to this in the debate. So what I would like to propose, I would like to say that many temporal modalities like duration, delay, acceleration, stagnation are resulting from a particular set of intended practices, activities, and behaviors. I often see, as I've already implied or suggested, I often see many books and articles unintentionally reinforcing what they criticize, actually. They are published with publishers whose drive is to make money rather than making intellectual scholarly contribution. Of course, there are exceptions to this rule. There's something like Open Humanities Press and Mattering Press and many other initiatives. But if you think how essential publishing houses and venues are for academic culture, this issue cannot be treated independently, the issue of publishing, from broader socio-economic structures of capitalism. That is actually, and these kinds of structures, socio-economic structures of capitalism, are mediating academic practices. They don't exist outside academia. There's no such thing as that. If someone publishes a highly critical book about academic, condemning, and often rightfully so, don't get me wrong, almost every single aspect of contemporary academia, and the price of this book is 160 British pounds, or 180 euros, or $190. There's something awkward going on, right? Indeed, I'm also guilty of this. And I'm not going to pretend that I'm the final sort of God who has managed to get to the earth and now will lecture about things. No, I'm guilty of this and I'm aware of this. My book, Accelerating Academia, costs more than $100 in paperback now, right? And the new book, the edited book that I've published, the Inquiring into Academic Timescapes, that's 160 euros, I think, 150 euros with Emerald. But I still hope that there is one thing that remained in this contemporary academic condition that we happen to be in. And I very much hope that we still are allowed to have a capacity to reflexively learn from mistakes. Because if I don't have this capacity, I would probably give up. I won't be doing what I'm doing. I won't probably be living even if I don't have if I'm not allowed to have a capacity to reflect upon my own mistakes. What's the point of living? What's the point of being in the world, to be a bit more Kierkegaardian here? I think that if I return to publishing, I think that the debate about where we publish, not what we publish, but where we publish, and perhaps maybe how often we publish, is the very first step and a kind of an embryonic possibility leading to something that I dare to call responsively stagnant academy or academia. And this would surely require such program, or such intellectual program, if you like, would probably require renegotiations of requirements requested by funders and evaluation systems. That's a big deal, actually. And let us not forget, let us not forget one important thing. Funders are more often than not bodies, public institutions, populated by academics. And the same goes for evaluation systems. They are calibrated by academics, not by some evil elite, which is sitting somewhere in the Winter Palace. No, there is no such thing as Winter Palace these days. And here comes another thing. The pace of global academic publishing, and these are data from 2013. The pace of global academic publishing output is unprecedented. I don't know what the situation is at the moment. 2021. But in 2013, and I'm pretty much convinced that it would be even worse now. The pace of global academic publishing output is totally unprecedented and has been unprecedented for a number of years. It raises almost by 10% every year. So it doubles every 9 years, basically. We have twice as many publications circulating all over the planet every 10 years or every 9 years. And evaluation systems in many countries and commitments to funders that we all have often force us to publish texts that nobody or hardly anybody ever reads, right? And in 2015, my very dear colleague and I, Teresa Steklova and myself, we published an essay in a Czech monthly sort of review, what's it called, magazine, called Text Without Readers, Frenetic Standstill of Science, where we developed this argument further, about the accelerating dynamics of publishing industry and what it does actually with the academic profession and with knowledge production systems. But what shall we do with all this? You might ask. Well, that's something I've been asking to myself for years. And I'm not sure if I have an answer, I don't know. I basically don't know. But there are a couple of things that I might suggest. And, I'm not trying to convince anybody or to pursue anything in a kind of a violent fashion, but I'm just offering things. I'm offering things. You either buy it or leave it. It's up to you. I'm a liberal in this sense. Kind of super liberal, almost libertarian, which I don't want to be. But anyway, I think that first of all, we should look at the history of art, because I think that some kind of a functional fix would be needed. Functional fix a la Marcel Duchamp, for instance, the ready-mades, or Le Corbusier, purism, or Bauhaus schools engagement with what they call new objectivity. And these iconic eclectic figures or movements of the 20th century art, to put it broadly, decided in certain stage of their existence that they wouldn't come up with anything radically new or original, but they would modify, they would combine, they would compose, they would assemble, they would melange already existing artifacts or resources or ideas or concepts and so on. They did not produce anything highly innovative, as everybody asks us academics to do these days. You need to be innovative. But what does it mean? Well, profit. That's what we mean by innovation, right? Mostly. It's not the case. Well, and I keep telling people often, like, have you ever heard about social innovations, for instance? No, what's that? Okay, well, then we need to start the debate over again. But back to the sort of avant-garde sort of artistic movements, because what they did actually was quite unprecedented and quite original, but not innovative, which is funny to me. And if we translate this, that we have kind of original artistic contribution, which is not necessarily innovative in an economistic sense, how should we translate this into the world of academia or academic reform, or another kind of academic utopia, or as Helga Schmidt calls it, euchronia, which is a kind of a new ways of how we can design temporality in various social arenas. So how should we translate this into contemporary academia? Well, what I would start with one simple proposition. We probably need, when we look at publishing and the whole publishing kind of dynamics, what I would really welcome, or what I love to read these days, and I've always loved that, commentaries, rejoinders, debates, interviews, books that are synthetic, that introductory books. It's so difficult to write an introductory book. I've never tried that, but when I talk to more senior colleagues of mine, and when they share with me the experiences, how tricky it is to write introductory book to philosophy or sociology or any kind of discipline, well, I'm always like amazed, and I'm like, wow, that's something else. And don't get me wrong, I'm not calling for any kind of anti-progressive erasure of discovery and invention and search for explanation or critique, but I'm calling for some kind of a modest reduction. And this is the second step, I think. So first step is this kind of reflexivity that I've mentioned before, and the second step is a kind of a practical arrangement that I have no idea of how to bring this into existence. And these two steps, reflexivity and a kind of structural change within the publishing domain, might be the very kind of beginning, the very kind of outset, if you like, or inception of something that I call responsibly stagnant academia. Okay, but you might ask, where is the notion of responsibility then? It's in the title of this talk, right? So you might be kind of wondering. I think that responsibility actually lies in what I would call responsiveness. And responsiveness must always be at the forefront of the ongoing socio-biological, geo-economic, and techno-scientific challenges of the present. It must be offering new utopias different economic sort of post-capitalist kind of ways of thinking, it must be offering accounts of what good life actually means today. And it must be also engaging with the questions and ways of how to enact and legislate these ideas. So legal issues, as Ivan already mentioned at the beginning, you know, the question of, for instance, I always like the tension between legality and legitimacy. They are not the same thing. Something can be legal, but it doesn't have to be legitimate. And it very much applies to various arrangements within the academic systems, I think. And I'm not saying that what I'm trying to describe is not happening. But unfortunately, it is often lost somewhere in the cacophony of current academic overproduction. And it's not just publishing overproduction, but overproduction of ideas, of concepts, for instance. And I'm again guilty of a new concept here. And setting academy into kind of responsive temporal regime, always on, always ready, but in a specific kind of way. This is something that we might call responsible. And a final note, there's been a very good book by John Smith called Toxic University. I wrote a quite critical review of this book, but I still like the notion of toxicity, which is very accurate. Because numerous instances of toxicity, if you wish, of contemporary academia, criticized by so many, actually have their origins within academia, ranging from various kinds of audit mechanisms and practices, KPIs, key performance indicators, balance sheets, targets, rankings, but also a particular kind of mindsets, particular kind of ideological drive, particular morality, which is associated with what's good, what's wrong. Let's go this way because it's good. Why do you think it's good? Because I was told that it's good. I've never experienced whether this arrangement might have a good implications, but I just think it will have. But also, you know, there is one interesting thing that I've recently registered, and that is how various managers, university managers, construct futures of university as an institution or as institutions. That's something very interesting to me. The thing is that, you know, the list can be endless, you know, of the sort of instruments and ways of thinking that are dominating contemporary academia. But what is often forgotten is that they are often sustained by mainstream economics and mainstream business schools, very powerful sort of instances in contemporary capitalism. And academia has undoubtedly became the trendsetter with respect to accumulation strategies that dominate contemporary capitalism. Strategies that first, and this is quite interesting, I think, strategies that first appeared in the corridors of universities, in the university dormitories. There are countless examples nowadays, right? Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook, where was it established with these other guys that the social network, the network film is all about? Where was it established? At the university. Travis Kalanick and Garrett Kemp, Uber, Brian Chesky and his colleagues, Airbnb. The list can be endless. And all these, mostly men, which is a gender issue here to me, all of them have developed business models that have become paradigm shifters while being enrolled at the university, usually Ivy League in the US, but not necessarily reducible to this. And here comes another provocation. And if such figures like Zuckerberg and Kalanick and Chesky, if such figures manage to transform once super wild and crazy and geek ideas that were skillfully taming the available technological instrumentarium into multi-billion global capitalist enterprises, why are non-commercial progressive ideas about the very configuration and setting of the university and the very ordering of the university, why are they moving primarily into dissent? And I think that responsible stagnation might be a good candidate that should be taken from the dissent and introduced to the mainstream thinking. Thank you very much for your attention.
Wow. Thank you so much, Philip, for your wonderful talk. Unfortunately, we cannot clap our hands, but I mean, okay, so for the next 20 minutes, Valerie will give her intervention or her response to your talk. And then from there on, we'll have our, we'll proceed with our discussions amongst ourselves, but also using the questions sent in earlier by the students and also the questions that I continue to encourage people to upload and also upvote. Yeah? You know, you can put in your question and also upvote. Okay, so Valerie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like to start by thanking the organization. Well, first and foremost, Ivan and Yannis more specifically, for inviting me today, but also for the very kind and generous way of guiding me in the preparation of today's presentation. And thank you, Philip, for a thought-provoking presentation. So I'm very happy that I get the chance to respond to it. But before I will do it, I will first say a few words about who I am, not necessarily about my affiliation, but just for you to know better from which position I speak in this debate. So first of all, unlike Philip, I'm not a sociologist of time, but I'm a geographer. And we usually deal with space rather than time, even though, of course, it might be difficult to disconnect the two. And I'm also a member of Slow Science in Belgium. And I will talk more about what this means. But for now, I want to emphasize that we are a diverse group of scholars with a shared interest in debating the future of academia, its direction and speed, and the linkages with broader society. But it does not mean that I speak for slow science and for everyone who is involved. So my relationship to the academy is therefore not a theoretical one. I don't study the academy in the same theoretical vein as Philip does. I'm more a scholar who has a practical relationship to the academy, and I use this as an instrument to challenge current academic power relations. And in terms of employment, I do not have a permanent position. So in the past year and a half, let's say since the start of the COVID pandemic, I have actually been employed on 5 short-term contracts, 2 of them as a researcher outside academia, actually. And of those 5 short-term contracts, I am now working on 2 of them, and the 6th will start next week. So in that sense, my perspective and position is one of an early career scholar, what you could call a rather precarious position, even though this precarious position still, of course, comes with quite some privileges. And actually, a lot of people I work with are in very similar situations. So it is fair to say that I have lived and experienced the acceleration of time in academia and the academic rat race in which most, if not all of us who are present here today, are working or studying in. I also have always worked in Belgium for a short period of time in the Netherlands, so I'm less familiar with other contexts. I think Philip's work is mostly situated in the UK and Czech Republic. So for me, it's mainly situated in Belgium and partly in the Netherlands. Also, I have this minor disclaimer. I was ill and I'm still a little bit ill. So if I interrupt occasionally because I have to cough or wipe my nose, please excuse me. And also I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. So I know that for some people, it's easier to follow like a presentation with a little bit of structure, but I just didn't have the time. I will work on my time jokes for this presentation, I promise. So slow science. Slow science in Belgium originated 10 years ago, after the famous or notorious, depending on the perspective, potato action in Wetteren in Belgium. I don't have enough time to discuss this event, unfortunately, but I think it's a very good example of the challenges academics face and how these relate to broader societal questions and debates. But for those of you who are interested, you can find more information on the webpage 3rottenpotatoes.wordpress.com. But just to give you an idea where slow science in Belgium originated. And indeed, the slow science in Belgium movement got their inspiration from the Slow Science Manifesto, which was not written by Slow Science in Belgium. We have our own manifesto, but there is a Slow Science Manifesto, which is quite known internationally, which is actually originating in German institutions. And I think it was written in 2010, if I'm not mistaken. So the first and most important thing I want to discuss is that slow science, or at least for us, is by no means a plea to do everything slower. We also internally discussed the name of slow science on many occasions, especially because indeed it sometimes provokes reactions such as, yeah, fast is not necessarily bad, or doing everything slow means you're always lagging behind in the accelerating world in which we live. And of course, our returning image of the snail, which is also appearing on the banner today, might indeed not be very helpful to counter that idea. But rather, we indeed criticize to what I think Filip and other scholars have called the speed excellence nexus. At ULB, so the Université Libre de Bruxelles, the French-speaking University of Brussels, there's a group of scholars who have gathered under the name of des excellences, which not necessarily the speed of academia is more central in their name, but the ever-increasing emphasis on excellence. So they disconnect it and they make it des excellences. So what is it? The opposite of excellence. But also that name, of course, has been criticized, as of course people sometimes wrongfully interpreted it as a call for mediocre research and teaching. So yeah, maybe one self-reflection might be that we need a better name to call slow science or des excellences in Belgium. So if everybody has better suggestions, you're very welcome. But for now on, we'll, I think, stick to the words of slow science. So if slow science is not about doing science at a lower speed, then what is it about? Well, we indeed get our inspiration from the slow food movement, and indeed not the upper middle class movement you're referring to, Filip, but the original slow food movement. And just like slow food, slow science questions the way knowledge or food comes into being, what processes lead to the quality of food, but we also care about the circumstances in which the food was grown and produced, including the conditions of labor needed to produce the food. So in that sense, slow science or slow food is less about time as such, but it is questioning the powers that be. I therefore totally agree that if slow food is conceptualized as like a fancy restaurant in which you pay a lot of money and wait an awful lot of time until your food is prepared, that we are talking about a privilege only available to the upper middle class who have the time and financial means to eat this food. And the same is true for spending a long time on cooking with homegrown ingredients. So it doesn't even have to be in a restaurant. I'm probably not the best person to make comparison with foods. It's first of all not my expertise, and those who know me know I can't cook at all. So let's go back to what this means for science. And indeed, I come back to an example you, Filip, already gave, namely the publishing of very critical and radical books who are then being sold for indeed 150 euros or even more. I agree with you that publishing more and expensive books is not what we need to do, just like we do not need more slow food restaurants. So science asks questions on why so many books are being published at such a high price, without actually changing the academic structures these books criticize. It therefore questions the power relations beneath the system. And the first step is therefore to acknowledge that the current academic system produces academics who have the time and the means to write these very radical texts in expensive books or behind the paywall of high impact factor journals, and who even build a career because of these texts, yet simultaneously they are reproducing the system they criticize in their publication strategies, yes, but also in their everyday academic practices. It is exactly the type of scholars that thrive in the current academic system. And yes, there are many other scholars who do things differently, but we need to acknowledge that they usually don't make it as far as those other type of scholars. So does that mean that we need to abandon writing critical text altogether or quit complaining, I think, as you have called it before? Of course not. We do have a problem if all this complaining is done in expensive books and behind the paywall of journals. But what we need is to understand and to see who is complaining and why, and even more important, what gets to be done with the complaining. I'm, of course, inspired by the work of Sarah Ahmed here, who in her latest book that I think was just published a couple of weeks ago, months ago, I don't know, into the topic of complaining and complaints, and more specifically, the complaints being addressed at universities regarding diversity work. And she writes, and I quote, "To hear complaints, you have to dismantle the barriers that stop us from hearing complaints. And by barriers, I am referring to institutional barriers, the walls, the doors that render so much of what is said, what is done, invisible and inaudible. If you have to dismantle barriers to hear complaints, hearing complaints can make you more aware of those barriers. In other words, hearing complaints can also be how you learn how complaints are not heard." End of quote. So that is more what slow science is about, at least to me. It is about understanding the power structures, the institutional boundaries and barriers, the questioning of the system in which we operate, and how to change this for the better without leaving people behind, and how this relates to who gets to produce knowledge, and which types of knowledges are being produced as a consequence, and which are left behind. It is questioning the everyday academic practices that constitute these systems. So yes, I share your concerns about the accelerating speed of academia, and I also share your opinion that null acceleration is necessarily bad. Just thinking about my own situation, the job I will be starting next week is the result of an application I submitted more than a year and 3 contracts ago. So yes, I do not have any intention to go back to some kind of, I don't know, nostalgic past in which there was time to think, a reality that actually never really existed, and for sure not for people who are not white or male. And of course, by no means I am implying that people in academia do not like their job, because indeed we do a lot of complaining, but that doesn't mean that people do not like their job. And honestly, I think many people enjoy parts or even most parts of their job and the autonomy they get in their job. Actually, I'm even convinced that this passion for research, I do not really like the term passion, but yeah, anyway, but that this passion for research, teaching, writing, thinking, and questioning is actually what makes academia continue doing what it does. Because let's be honest, if being an academic were to be a shitty job, academia would have collapsed a very long time ago. So the question now is where to go from here, because if I understand correctly, I think we might agree on many of the causes and consequences of the acceleration in academia and how unsustainable and problematic the current system is. But I think we might disagree on the strategies to follow from here. I'm not very familiar with the work of Stevie de Saille and her colleagues. So what I know about responsible stagnation is what I hear in your presentation today and what I read in advance. And so the questions that come to mind are the following. First, as you mentioned, the term originates in an economic model which tries to bypass the dogma of endless economic growth, which I think is a very laudable goal. And even though I'm no economist, what is the word? Economist? Yes, economist. This seems to be much in line with what slow science actually would argue for. Yet, if this term is situated within a market logic and therefore an economic logic, then it also means we will keep on conceptualizing the university as a firm. And maybe this is what slow science wants to rethink in the first place. Inspired by the work of Jan Blommaert, I would say that it is also important to step outside of that discourse, because discourse and language also determines our thinking and therefore our actions. So in what sense does the term responsible stagnation actually alter our thinking fundamentally and the powers that be? Maybe my reluctance to use the concept is nothing more but sheer ignorance. And if I would have had more time to prepare, I would have loved to delve more into the existing literature on that. But from what I understood so far, and maybe you can comment on that later on, is that responsible might risk to individualize the problem in the same way that we are also demanded to be responsible with food, to come to the slow food analogy. But who can blame the single parent to feed their children a Dr. Oetker pizza after a long and tiring day at work, when the only available fast option, or even option altogether, is a fast food option from the nearby supermarket? And to act responsible is not a given in itself. Who is responsible and how responsibility is interpreted varies enormously. And the courage to do the right or responsible thing doesn't automatically come with an academic degree or title, even though it should be, but anyway. And the current academic system even values those who write those progressive and radical texts, but do the opposite in the everyday actions. So to me, stagnation and responsible stagnation seems to indicate that if we do more of the same, but maybe slightly different, and maybe with a little bit more of ethical reflection, that the problem is solved, rather than fundamentally challenging the system as such. But maybe this is more of a conceptual discussion. It's more a discussion about which concepts to use or not. So let's extend this discussion to the different temporalities you've mentioned, because we've discussed many types of time and temporal rhythms so far. And I want to include in this discussion one set of temporal rhythms that seems to be missing so far. And maybe there is a way to connect this temporal rhythm with the term responsible stagnation. I don't know. But I think this temporal rhythm that I'm going to introduce is fundamental in rethinking what another university could look like and which strategies we could adopt. It is the rhythm of all reproductive and care work. The way our universities are structured now seem to be totally detached from anything. In the first place, from our bodies. Those who feed us in the cafeterias, take care of our children, clean the classrooms and offices, so we are able to teach, to do research, to write, and to think, are often not even our colleagues anymore. They are outsourced to firms, are underpaid, or are a combination of both. At this very university, the University of Antwerp, it was decided that all cleaning staff would be fired and then hired back under worse labor conditions, so that there need not be any additional budget cuts on research and teaching. But how can we pretend that what is necessary to live, and therefore to do research and teaching, is not connected to our universities? This is what Mary Mellor describes as a patriarchal neoliberal idea of men as a category or an ideal, as always fit, healthy, fed, and rested, as if we are detached from time and place. Not only are these imaginary male agents detached from caring and other social relations, they are also detached from time and place and can move around everywhere. So if you think about international mobility, for example, we are often expected to do exactly the same job, just in another location, completely disconnected from our social networks and from the places in which we are situated. So as such, universities have become disembodied and detached institutions. But what type of knowledges do we produce if we forget the lived realities of parents who need to stop preparing a lecture 5 minutes after they started it because a toddler wants to play with a new toy, or their baby needs a diaper or be fed? How can we understand climate change without understanding the lived realities of those people who lose their income after generations of working in the fields? Or how can we understand migration without knowing the embodied emotions that such a traumatic period in one's life creates? And how can we as academics understand the world if we do not take into account our ill, hungry, stressed, pregnant, sexy, fat, tired, excited, or disabled bodies and the temporal rhythms they create? So what would another university look like that does? Would we still outsource our colleagues who feed us and clean our classrooms and take care of our children? I don't think so. Because it is an illusion to think that the individual white male genius was detached from his own body. And it's also exactly the impossibility to stop this work, this reproductive and care work, that makes the temporal rhythm of reproductive and care work such a determining factor in everything that we do. I don't know, maybe you're also, those who are watching from home, maybe are very hungry and thinking like, when will this lecture be over? Well, it really limits the concentration you have. So in that sense, it's a very determining factor, all the reproductive work and all the care work that we do. And yet, there is no way in which academic structures take these temporal rhythms into account. And if we do, then it's usually done by putting additional work onto those who lack time. For example, when we demand from early career scholars why they have a gap in their career after pregnancies or being ill, or by students to prove that they require more time to finish an assignment when taking care of loved ones, or when one of their loved ones has died. And so my final attempt on making a food analogy, of course, we do not want the tired single parents to be made responsible not to serve their children a fast but not very nutritious Dr. Oetker pizza. But what if that single parent, who might very well be an academic, come home after work and is able to buy nutritious food in a supermarket that is affordable, and which has been produced in fair and ecological circumstances? Or even more fundamentally, what if she comes home after work and is able to serve nutritious food to her children, food which has been cooked in a community kitchen in which she also works 2 evenings per week, and which is prepared with produce from the neighborhood in which she lives? I promise that I will do a better job on food analogies for a next occasion, but I hope that you get what I mean to say with it. So science is not just a discourse, but it is an everyday academic practice which questions and resists the current unequal academic system, which is to a large extent maintained by exploitation, discrimination, and exclusion. So yes, we need to think about slow publishing. Actually, to respond to your question, Filip, there are indeed scholars and organizations who have made a plea for that, and they are thinking of other ways of publishing more in line with slow science. But we need to do so much more. And I have only touched upon a very small set of temporal rhythms that are often forgotten in the current academic system. I haven't even addressed the racial, ableist, heteronormative, or colonial structures that underpin our current academic structures, and the epistemological consequences this has for the way our society is structured. Thinking of other ways, I'm thinking, for example, about the research project called Decolonize Science, which plans to translate 180 scientific papers from the Africa Archive preprint server into 6 African languages. Maybe I will even call them, because otherwise it's just languages we don't know, right? So the isiZulu and Northern Sotho from Southern Africa, Hausa and Yoruba from West Africa, and Luganda and Amharic from East Africa. And these languages are collectively spoken by around 98 million people. So what does it do for knowledge production when this knowledge is actually available for more people? And vice versa, how do we get the knowledge that is within these communities back to other people? Or think about recent research, which has debunked lots of the science on sexual selection, which has for a long time been dominated by a Victorian sexual morals, in which we now interpret sexual selections in a totally different way. So what if we look with different eyes to the type of knowledge that we are producing? So in that sense, I think we need to fundamentally link universities with the society in which they are based. And this starts with imagining another university and with change being possible. And it's true that maybe slow science has not been successful yet in fundamentally changing academia, but why not use our position in the margins as a useful vantage point to start imagining another university and change the university by doing? So yeah, these were some of my comments, and maybe Filip, you want to respond to them, or maybe people in the audience have questions first.